Well, hey there, it's your old pal Keith from Wavetables.lol. That's Wavetables.lol, home of KRC Mathwaves, the world's largest collection of wavetables and other stuff. You know I'm a big fan of creating wavetables, using wavetables in interesting ways, and a couple of weeks ago I took a look at this new plugin called Wavefield from a developer called Fine Increments, and I was so interested in this plugin and what it does and how it was created that I reached out to its creator, Seth Watson, founder of Fine Increments, and he kindly spent an hour talking with me about his development choices, his background, using AI in the creation of new audio tools, and all sorts of other stuff. Check it out. Also, Wavefield is past its intro price, but if you check the description or the pinned comment, you may find a coupon code to get a discount on Wavefield. Another thing that Seth recently introduced is his free wavetable generator that's over at Fine Increments. There will be links in the description, of course. You'll also find a link to my original review of Wavefield, which I think is fantastic, and the product just keeps getting better. It's now at version 1.0.6. I think that's what it is. Yeah, 1.0.6. Fixed some bugs and added some cool new features like bulk wavetable import and stuff like that. So with that, let's talk to Seth Watson from Fine Increments and see what this is all about. Well, Seth Watson from Fine Increments, thank you for taking the time to chat with us today. It's great to meet you. We have chatted over email, but we haven't had a little in-person chat, have we?
Absolutely, Keith. I've been looking forward to this. We've been going back and forth, and I noticed your love for wavetables immediately. And once I saw Liminal Space, I was like, this guy is a kindred spirit. We need to talk.
That was my first take too. For people who haven't seen my review, I did do a review of Wavefield, and there'll be links in the description. There's always links in the description. And I first saw Wavefield when Skippy from Plugin Guru took a look at it on his Saturday live stream a few weeks ago, and I was like, oh wow, this thing sounds really cool. And then Seth was in the chat there and answering questions, which was really cool. So I'm really glad that he took the time to share that, because I thought it was a really interesting plugin. And so I went and grabbed the demo of that immediately. And I was kind of shocked by how sophisticated it was. So we'll definitely talk about Wavefield and your other new project, your online wavetable builder, which is really cool. But first, I was kind of wondering, like, what is your background in music, and then what's your background in technology, and how do those things intersect?
Totally, yeah. And thank you, by the way, for inviting me on this. I really appreciate being on your channel and having a chance to talk about these things. My background started at age 4. I played classical piano from a very young age, and around age 12, I kind of got disinterested in being a robot that just read off of a sheet. And I was like, they're not teaching me how to be creative, Like, I need someone to, teach me how to make music. And, I started getting into guitar and what was on the radio, and started playing in bands locally, and just just for fun. I grew up in Wisconsin, so, really backwoods, kind of just, playing at bars for, just for fun. And I was actually kind of trying to take it seriously, but it's hard to find people around there that do take it seriously. It's one of the reasons why I ended up moving to LA. But I started getting into like all the effects that you can use, and tweaking knobs, playing synthesizers. I played keyboard in a few bands, like an Earth, Wind, and Fire kind of a band. And
cool.
yeah. I was the only white guy. And we had a lot of fun, but I was always kind of like hungry to like take it seriously, and I couldn't find people that were really taking it that seriously out there. So I ended up going to school at Columbia College in Chicago, and started meeting a bunch of people there that were actually working in the industry, and I took like composition and music, audio technology courses and things like that, and really started getting pretty deep into it, and a lot of different genres, got introduced to all kinds of things, and so my musical taste is kind of all over the place. But before that, I had probably been, while I was in college, potentially the person who took the most electives out of anyone ever. I did a 6-year stint in college, just having fun and getting a philosophy degree, knowing fully well that that was not my one-way ticket to getting a soapbox job or something like that after I get out. And, I kind of, saw that, people don't generally get jobs in the degree that they have unless it's something credentialed,
Right. Yeah.
And I started taking a lot of computer science and just things that I was interested in. I had been dabbling in like MS Basic at that time, so that tells you a little bit about how old I am, probably.
Yeah. No worries, I'm definitely older than you. It's fine.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I had fun. My great idea of a Saturday was sitting down and like coding images in MS Basic, and so I wanted to take that further, and so I started taking some development courses and building my own little tools, and later on after that I ended up learning a lot more about web development through online courses, got into a little bit of like dabbling in blockchain coding. And just things that I thought were fun, like I never professionally worked as a developer. It was just something that I found fun, and I always considered myself a musician, like that was always what I was going to do in life is, make music. And so following a year and a half at Columbia, I was like, you know what, I'm learning so much online about music production. I don't really need school for this. So I just kind of, I was trying to decide like, what should I do? So I moved out to California, and, I knew that there was more opportunity out here. And, so I started, producing a lot of EDM, and, I had like a 5-year stint as a drum and bass producer.
Oh, cool.
Went by Riddance. And, did some other flavors of EDM, but, like, I don't know, like I kind of, I'm pretty critical of my own music, and I don't often feel like it's good enough to release. And so kind of like, until somebody tells me like, hey, you need to release this, I kind of just do it for fun, and, try to get better and better at it. But that's a little bit of my background, just,
cool.
Kind of like amateur development for fun. And, about a year ago, a little under a year ago, when AI started becoming a thing, I tried to make this product that I had an idea of for like 8 years. I was like, when I was in a production session one time, I was looking at a 3D spectrogram, and I wanted it to move like an ocean, like I was like, I wonder if there's a tool out there that can actually, like warp the frequency spectrum to, in complex evolving ways that you can't get from a fixed band filter. And I looked around and I couldn't find anything, and I just kept producing for years. And this idea was just kind of like in the back of my head, just sitting there, like this thing would be really cool if it existed. And I never saw any company make anything like that. I've been a consumer of plugins. I have 1,500 paid plugins. Yeah, and
join the club.
Like I watch the industry. I kind of know what's out there. And when I saw that there was an opportunity for this thing to exist and nobody was really making it, I was like, okay, I'm gonna use AI to learn how to code in C++ and do the things that I never learned how to do before. And I even, when I first started building it, I was really using the AI to learn, and I was going line by line and like
Right.
trying to do it the really slow way, and it was going very slow. And then I learned a little bit more how AI could be used more effectively to go faster,
Yeah.
and to the point where and I'm pretty close to AI. I mean, like I've worked in SaaS companies and tech companies, and like my wife works for an AI company, and like I'm close enough to it that I see where things are going, and
Yeah.
even developers in these companies are moving away from using line by line code writing.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
it's becoming
Well, and those coding tools have evolved really quickly, since they came out, right? So I
100%.
mean, I guess it's more than 2 years since I did KRC Mathwaves, which, I mean, the big enabler for KRC Mathwaves was having access to AI systems, right? Because, like, while I had done all sorts of programming for like fourth generation languages and, had done like plugins for no code and low code environments, right? So web development stuff, that was something I've been doing, well, since the invention of the interweb. um, I was like, oh, I started to understand like Python was like the kind of the cool new equivalent of 4GLs. And I was like, oh, I bet this thing could teach me Python. And like, we could like actually iterate as we go. Right. And so, because it was the same thing, I'd kind of had this block on like, what's the, like, I was kind of trying to replicate this stuff from this collection called Galbanum that you probably know about. It's like the original big collection of single cycle waveforms and wavetables. And
Okay.
the process that maybe you haven't heard of it. So anyway, it's pretty cool actually. It's still available. I think it's like if you want like 29,000 waveforms and I don't know a similar number of wavetables, this product called Galbanum has those in it. And the documentation kind of talked about like how they were created and things, but
Mhm.
but not in a really explicit way. And so it took me like a long time actually to work out, oh, okay, this is just additive synthesis to like make these individual waveforms. And then, I mean, it was much easier to understand like how a wavetable is made. I mean, that's almost trivial. But yeah, it was AI tools that like got me there. It was like, early versions of ChatGPT. And what's really crazy now, I even did a video about this, that given what I'd learned and like the stuff like from my video transcripts and like what I'd published online about the different wavetable formats and how they work and also about like how I built KRC Mathwaves, like now you can kind of one shot that with ChatGPT, even though it like took me like weeks of
Yeah.
like exploring techniques and things. It's like you can now go, hey, I want to make a thing like that's like KRC Mathwaves. Like, how was that created? Right. And it can just tell you, and it'll
Exactly.
and it can write code, like demo code that would give you like one waveform or even like a simple wavetable. It can just like do that now. So
Totally.
it's pretty crazy. And
Yeah.
yeah, and that
I think
also
the direction. Sorry. Go ahead.
no, I was saying that also like played a role in liminal space because like
Okay.
I haven't hadn't developed audio plugins before, but I had checked out Chris from Air Windows like open source projects that the Air Windows plugins, and I was like, oh, okay, I see how this works. Even though he doesn't build like UIs, so he does plugins that just use like the kind of the default knobs or sliders or whatever your DAW uses for that. And so just like
Yeah.
kind of
Check out
iterating on
his
that,
stuff.
I was able to like finally get to like, oh, like an actual like finished plugin, which is kind of cool. I mean, I guess,
Yeah, but what I noticed about liminal space is that it's a great idea, and that's I think that's where we're headed. That's the direction we're going. It's where the focus is going to be more on like who has the best ideas, who understands the industry and the problems that music producers have
yeah,
the best, and who has the persistence to actually turn it into a final product and get it out and market it and like
yeah,
do everything. And the way I look at it is a similar consolidation that's happened in a number of areas. You know, you've got music producers now being indie, you know, solopreneurs and having to do all of the roles that would historically have been done by a separate producer, separate engineer, separate everything.
Yeah, it's
you know,
crazy.
And so like when you look at what it takes to actually have a whole company, right? Like you have a product, but you also have to have a licensing system for a plugin. You also have to have like a website and a way of managing those licenses. And you have to, you know, like have much more than just a finished product. And so I think, you know, you start to have to think more in terms of system architecture, and you have to understand like some of the things that normally would have been done by a separate DevOps guy and a separate, you know, C++ expert and a separate, you know, front end or website designer, you know, separate everything. But now it's like, you know, you can actually do all of these things. But I really do think you need to understand something about code.
Yeah.
You know, in order to get there.
Yeah, this is one of the things I wanted to get to with you because, like, I mean, I know, so, like, I have very mixed feelings about generative AI as a whole, right? But there's no denying that, like, all developers today, like, use these tools for something, right? Like, I work on a corporate website, and, you know, all our, like, we've got Copilot connected to our GitHub, right? And it reviews all our PRs for like bonehead errors and stuff like that, you know? And it's just like, that's a huge, you know, it can be a big time saver, you know, those kind of things. But then there is a trend now, and I think it sounds to me like you were working on Wavefield a little bit before this started to happen. And I was definitely doing KRC Mathwaves before this kind of thing started happening. But I am seeing a lot of like AI shovelware. You know, there is like kind of AI slop plugins that they might look good, but there's like no uniqueness to them. It's like who needs another generic EQ or a compressor or whatever, and you know that's kind of like that's kind of dumb. And people have sent me stuff like that. I'm like oh okay, I can tell that this was quote unquote vibe coded. And and there's just like I'm not even going to talk about it to my audience, but I feel like tools like Wavefield are a lot different. It's like you had a vision for a certain type of processing that you wanted to do, and it also sounds like, because I've seen some of your follow-up videos, which I guess they're shorts on YouTube, where you talked about like the actual process, like what is the processing that's going on. And it's clear that you understand that. So it's like Wavefield is not a thing that was one-shotted. Make me a plugin that can take a wavetable and make a filter out of it, right? Like there's obviously more thought that goes into it.
It did take about 6 months to build the sort of prototype of it, and then it did go through 4 months of beta, where a lot of the input from beta testers was actually implemented. And I think that's one of the really interesting things that I think, when you have AI, you can move faster than some of these bigger companies who are, taking a bit longer and, aren't as responsive to user input.
I'm looking at you, Arturia. I'm looking at you, Arturia, who I always find bugs in Arturia things and they take months to get fixed. And it's like, really, you couldn't just one, no one's reported this, and then two, you're gonna take 6 months to fix it.
Yeah. So while I did start with a vision, I really truly believe in providing a service that's wanted and needed, a product that serves solves a problem that people have, and if somebody requests features, I really do take it seriously and implement it, and as long as it's in alignment with the overall vision, But yeah, no, I do get your point on the AI slop, and I think we're, I think with any computerized, tool that we've ever had, there's, any computer may have the ability to calculate better than any human out there. in a short amount of time, but you always have needed to enter a question or a prompt into it, and you've always needed to evaluate the output. And those are actual skills. Those are actual abilities that a human being has that can be developed. And on the prompting side, like knowing what to build, knowing what features to put in, it is something that requires a bit of familiarity. So if you've never been around the music industry, if you've never used played an instrument or, been in a DAW, and you're like, I'm going to make a bunch of plugins, like probably what's going to come out is a bunch of average compressors and reverbs and things like that don't solve actual problems that producers have. And if you don't understand code at all, you're not going to be able to, like, I actually watch the output. I watch the output and I try to understand it. And if there's words in there that I don't understand, I try to get clarification and, understand, like you saw, I made a video about the pipeline, how it's different from other plugins that might look a little bit similar on the surface. What makes Wavefield really unique actually is that, that you can actually draw a shape in Wavefield, and that shape is the filter. And what you're drawing on is a wavetable frame. And that isn't possible with the convolution style ones. They use convolution because it's a simplification in the math, basically, of how the processing happens to avoid some of the artifacts and things that are potentially going to be there if you don't. It comes down to processing individual blocks at a time versus processing a real-time stream of blocks. And if you're processing individual blocks at a time, those blocks have to be stitched together.
Yeah. Is that part of why Wavefield has kind of it's got quite a bit of latency in it? Like, right? It's kind of not an insert. It's more like you'd use it at like mix down or something, really, because if you put it on just like a single instrument track, at least for me, like in Bitwig, like there's a little too much latency than actually play. So you kind of have to like take it off or disable it for a while, and then so I sort of view it as more of like a mixing stage kind of plugin, which is not uncommon, of course. Like a lot of tape emulators are like that. It's not for real time tracking.
Correct. Yeah, it never was really intended for that. Even though I've gone to lengths to make it work with some of these live hosts. Cool. It can work in them. Like
you just have to set your buffer size
Unify.
Larger. Is that? Oh, I was just saying, do you have to just set the buffer size larger, or to reduce? Does that reduce latency or no?
No, the latency is going to pretty much stay the same. It's just a matter of like the way live hosts work is actually slightly different in how they, how they sync things to the transport.
Yeah.
So those are some things that I had to fix for Unify 2. And
cool. I probably need to try it again, actually, because I was on a much earlier version, and you're at 1.06 now, right?
Yeah.
I bet it behaves a little better. And also, I didn't notice that there was any extra like latency in Unify when Skippy was demoing it. So it's interesting.
It's not going to show up as latency unless you're trying to use it live. The DAWs will pre-process, and it'll seem real time what's happening according to your transport. Mm-hmm. But unless you're like on stage trying to use Wavefield at a live gig, you should be fine.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. It's a great effect. I wasn't being critical of it. I was just like talking about a thing I noticed. I wanted to know, actually, I do think I understand how Wavefield works, but it's literally like, so you have the wavetable, and the wavetable is basically it's essentially making like an EQ curve, right? It's defining the shape of the filter, right? So the upward going parts are boosts and negative parts are reductions, yeah?
Exactly. The big difference with EQs is that EQs and filter shapes are defined by an equation that has a specific shape, and limited to a fixed set of shapes, like,
Yeah.
Your high pass, low pass, your bells, your shelves and things like that.
Right.
And then you have to have a cutoff frequency that defines where the shaping begins. And then you move that cutoff around. And in order to get complex evolving motion with those kinds of EQs and filters, it involves like a ton of LFO modulation. You have to have a bunch of shapes going at one time, and you can kind of approximate somewhat what Wavefield is doing, but not exactly, because Wavefield is drawing an arbitrary shape.
Right.
You can draw it. You can, make it whatever shape you want, and then that becomes your filter. And the fact that like I was saying before, the blocks are meticulously stitched together in such a way that the phase is very clean, and that everything is reconstructed properly. Wavefield can afford to work purely in that magnitude world without, it's phase transparent, and you can work directly with the curves that you're drawing. You can't do that with filter table.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Right. Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Like, but that is the difference, I think. Well, and it also sounds different. I mean, I think the sounds that I was getting out of Wavefield were more appealing to me than filter table. Although filter table being a snap-in, right, it can be part of a phase plant voice, which is kind of cool. And it is interesting, but I haven't really like experimented with filter table. Like it didn't spark my imagination in the way that Wavefield did, right? Because I was immediately like, oh, I want to try out all my different like types of wavetables. And like one thing that's really interesting about what you're doing that's very different from using waveforms and wavetables as an oscillator is that the magic with Wavefield is really about like how shapes move in the time domain across the frequencies, right? And so like you'll get kind of mid results if you just take like say a sawtooth wave that I have all these wavetables that are like variations on all the classic synthesizer waveforms, like sawtooth waves that go from a ramp to then like an exponential ramp. And like that has an effect in Wavefield, but it's not super dramatic, or it's not really the interesting part. But if you take things like my Bezier curve wavetables, which are like, it's a time domain technique where like the waveforms are composed of Bezier curves and they're morphing over the course of the wavetable, like that gives like really wild results in Wavefield.
Absolutely. It's all about the morphing, and Wavefield will take an incoming wavetable and it'll create a new wavetable within the plugin that's 128 frames.
Right.
And then it'll morph between those, and it'll interpolate between. So even if your file that you load has only 2 frames in it, it'll make a longer wavetable that's interpolated between. So the more variation that you can get in the different shapes, the more evolving complex motion comes out of the frequency curve.
Right. So internally, it sounds to me like internally what you do is you actually do the interpolation and you build you build a grid of the frames, right? Rather than doing the computation like in real time.
A wavetable is built, but it actually does the computation at runtime in real time.
Oh, got it. Yeah.
I know some of, with convolution, you can do like a one shot, I guess I could have done this too, but like, that's just how Wavefield works the fast Fourier transform is done in real time.
Got it. Yeah. That was, that was one of the things I was thinking about with liminal space. It's like, so in liminal space, it actually, so whatever frames the wavetable has, like in wavetables are used for like the LFOs and stuff like that. it and like as modulation sources. So it actually like on every sample computation, like it computes what the interstitial wavetable is, which is maybe not the most efficient way to do it, but it like it gives the most accuracy, I guess, in a way. And I wanted to keep kind of the memory footprint small. So it's just interesting to talk to other people who've like had to deal with those kinds of issues, right? It's like, well, do you pre-compute this or do you not? Because the other thing I wanted to be able to do is like you could immediately swap out. You could switch to a different LFO without there being any dropouts, right? So there's no time to go and like, oh, we're just going to recompute this whole wavetable. We just do it sample accurately as the processing is happening.
Yeah, in Wavefield, it really would only apply to the spectral IR mode, where it is doing a sort of convolution-ish thing. You could do that in one shot, or you could do that continuously, and it just happens to do it continuously.
Yeah, that's actually a really cool mode, by the way. It's so interesting, all the different sounds that you can get out of Wavefield. I guess a lot of that brings us to your latest project, which I know you just released a video on a few hours ago, and it's like your free wavetable generator. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. I built it really with Wavefield in mind because I wanted there to be a resource that allowed me to create presets for Wavefield, and that's where it actually began as a tool for me to use to create the initial presets that are algorithmic. And then I was like, why don't I just release this on my website as a free wavetable generator and build it out with more features and make it really cool. So that's really where that came from. So the algorithms that are being used are really all about creating that interesting spectral motion. And you'll find that uniqueness can translate over into synthesis as well if you use those wavetables for synthesis. The multi-shape modes that are on the first page, the first tab, those can add harmonics basically as you go throughout the wavetable. So if you're using it for synthesis, it would be adding harmonics. Works differently in Wavefield because it's not an oscillator, but you don't see that many people. Like I shared this in a forum, and one of the users there was like, "Oh man, I was doing this manually in Serum, and it was taking forever." And like, I'm so glad I have the resource now to make these these wavetables that evolve along the harmonic.
No, I thought it was really cool. There's a bunch of great ideas, but then there's also like Wavefield, like more Wavefield specific ideas in there. Like you can rotate the phase of the thing over frames, right? Which is like that to me kind of defines the Wavefield sound. It's like you want these boosts and these your boosts and your reductions to like change over the spectrum over time. And whereas if you use that as an oscillator, like, you can do that, but what's happening is like, if you're just rotating the phase of the oscillator, that's nothing that you can't do another way, right? Like a Serum and like modwave, like they have it. You can modulate phase of the oscillator, so it's like you don't really need to. For an oscillator, you don't need to build that into the wavetable, right? But with Wavefield, like there's definite advantages to like making these new kinds of wavetables that wouldn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense as oscillators. So I just thought that was really cool. And like, I will probably make a batch of wavetables that are actually, designed for Wavefield, like once I, kind of explore it some more.
That'd be awesome. Yeah, and what you're talking about, like if you use the free wavetable generator I built, there's a motion parameter that essentially continuously rotates the phase.
Yeah.
And then what that means in Wavefield is your shape that you built moves from left to right, up and down the frequency spectrum.
Yeah.
And it does like a filter sweep of whatever complex shape that you have.
But it can be really crazy filter sweeps with like lots of neat resonant peaks and stuff. Yeah. That's pretty cool.
Exactly.
I'm kind of wondering, like, in terms of like music technology stuff, so beyond Wavefield, which is definitely cool, like what other cool stuff have you seen recently, and like what are you thinking about in music technology world these days?
I see so many cool things. I mean, I like what Neural DSP has been doing. I think they make really great products. There's Inspired Acoustics. I saw something by them recently that's really doing a really cool spatial convolution reverb kind of a thing where you can, place things within a 3D environment. That was really inspirational to me. I like Devious Machine stuff. I always have. Ever since Texture came out, I was like, this is actually solving a problem that producers have, and that's, I often, run into problems when I'm producing where I'm like, man, why doesn't something like this exist? And then something like that comes out and it's like a breath of fresh air. Like,
Yeah.
people are doing this thing manually and stitching together things, and they made something that actually does it automatically. Unify 2, when I found out about that, I was pretty excited. Shane Dunn, who was part of developing the original Unify, introduced me to the Polybox, or I think it's called
Oh,
Polybox.
yeah. He did the same thing. He did the same thing with me. I think Shane, I think that Shane has a soft spot for like fledgling developers.
Yeah.
And yeah, like he and I got into conversations. And I was like, well, like here's one. So the question I asked, I was like, as I was like, I'd already built Liminal Space and I was thinking about other like plugin ideas. And I was like, why isn't there a plugin that in the voice chain takes other plugins? Which is right, which points in the
Hmm.
direction of Polybox. But he's like, dude, you could try that, but that's Unify. Like Unify is a plugin that hosts plugins, and he's like, it's the biggest pain in the ass supporting. Like, if you do this, everybody will come to you and ask you to support every single dingle stupid plugin that comes out. Right? And I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, okay, well that explains it. And then he explained Polybox. It's like if you want to do that, you can make an N voice synthesizer in Unify that just uses multiple instances, and then you can insert plugins on each individual voice, which
Yeah.
is that's
That's
super rad.
that's something I was doing manually, and we talked about. Um, there's this Max for Live device called Polymind
Uh-huh.
that will take an incoming MIDI signal and split its notes into satellite sort of plugins, basically,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
you can put on different tracks. And I liked using that for, you turn the glide time up on a bunch of synths that you want to receive like a single note.
Mhm.
So you play a chord in Polymind, and then it'll shoot an individual note. The next incoming note will go to a different synth, and then you get this gliding, because like the last note that one of those synths received was way down here, but then the next note that it receives is somewhere else, and so
Yeah.
you get this like warping, gliding kind of continuous thing, and you can do that with Polybox too. Which when I
Yeah.
found that out, I was like, wow, that turned Unify 2 and basically into a super synth for me. Like I look
Yeah.
at Unify like it's a super synth. Like you could put 10 instances of Serum in there and
Yeah.
put,
Right.
like get all your settings right for each one, and then save it, and then you can load it up in any DAW. I thought that was
Yeah.
really
Yeah, that's I actually so yeah, when I did my overview of Unify 2, since like Shane had explained that to me, I did a whole patch like live where I took like, 8 instances of Omnisphere 3 and like each with slightly different patches in them, but then that had like radically different effects on the output, right? And it's just like it's next level is overused, but it's like it's an element of like kind of crazy randomness and next level sound designy stuff that you couldn't easily do any other way.
totally. Some of the other things, I just discovered Dawsum actually, oddly. Like I
Yeah.
should have found out about them a lot
Uh-huh.
longer ago, but I think some of their stuff is really inventive and beautifully designed. You know,
Yeah.
their UIs are great. Beat surfing, beat surfing random, and I don't know if you've seen those.
I don't know those
Really,
ones.
those are really interesting.
Huh.
Unfiltered audio. Yeah, there's just so many. Like, and I, the ones that I use on a regular basis are probably the same kind of like workhorse emulations and, like typical run-of-the-mill stuff when I'm producing.
Yeah.
But then there's the occasional thing that if I'm going for a specific effect,
Right.
I'll reach for texture or whatever,
Yeah. Yeah. You said that your musical influences are kind of all over the place, but I'm always curious, like, who are your musical touchstones, and like, what are your favorite musicians and why?
Wow.
Not to
Yeah,
put you on the spot.
there's so many. I mean, like I studied classical, so I was into like Debussy and Eric Satie and Chopin and stuff like that
Yeah.
for a while, and definitely had the '90s alternative phase of Smashing Pumpkins and Radiohead and Nirvana and all that good stuff. But I feel like in any time period, there's always some salient artists that are just really doing something authentic, and I look for that. I look for artists that have integrity, so that they're commercial, but they also have artistic integrity. They're not just popular; they're popular, and they're great. They have great musicianship and artistry, and so I had a folk period, Joni Mitchell, Nick Drake, stuff like that. I had I've been into definitely had, like I said, EDM, so all the probably standard, Skrillex, and
Right.
I was a drum and bass producer, so like Noisia, Billin, Matthews, Ivy Lab, I got like Virtual Riot. There's a whole bunch of great.
Yeah.
There's so much great music, but you'll also catch me listening to like metal and like Sleep Token and
Yeah.
Bad Omens and stuff like that. So it's really just all over the map. But I am really looking for art, true art, somewhere in the commerce.
Yeah. Right.
I think you have to have commerce involved if you're going to be reaching people at all,
Yeah.
But otherwise you're just making music for yourself.
Right. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but yeah.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
my mom's an artist. She has made a lot of art for herself for a long time, and hopefully I was part of this. Kind of inspiring her to be a little bit more commercial with what she's doing. Like you should charge money for this.
Yeah.
It's worth something. Your time is worth it. This is all really valuable stuff you're doing, and I think a good 50-50 down the middle of the road split between art and commerce is a good place to be.
I don't disagree with that. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I guess, yeah, the kind of the similar thing there, right, is like, I appreciate what people do with open source, right? But like what I have learned, and like why everything that I do that I'm serious about, like I turn into a product, even if it's a cheap and cheerful one, is that there's a cost to supporting it. Like if you put something out there that people desire, people will buy it, and then you actually owe them something. Like you owe them like attention to their problems, and you owe them getting their money's worth out of what they spent, right? And it's just like, sometimes people are like, well, shouldn't this just be free? And I'm like, well, then I couldn't afford to even answer this question of should it be free if if someone asks me, because it's like it takes your time and your energy to do these things.
Yeah, I think people, especially in the software world, have gotten used to a lot of things being free, but they don't realize that they are their data is the thing that is valuable, and it's being collected, and things like that. I do see a lot of that in the plugin world, where like there's tons of free plugins, and I don't know if that has to do with the fact that people don't want to bother designing and building a licensing system or paying all that money to Pace or what.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah, I think it's, I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, um, who I'm thinking of because I'm working on a video about them, but I'm thinking about like audio damage. So audio damage like stopped putting a licensing system in their plugins like years ago because Chris actually found himself like just having too many hassles, like support hassles that, just with the licensing system, right? Or people not understanding what's their key, and stuff like that, right? And it takes up your time, and he's like, it's not worth it. It doesn't cut down on piracy, at least from his perspective, and it consumes his time. I mean, your licensing system worked great for me. So, if so maybe you don't have any problems with it, but there's people that are either like, I'm going to lock the whole thing down, or they're just like, screw that. It's like, if you want to steal from me, go ahead, but if I find this online, I will DMCA you, so.
Yeah,
It's
I mean,
weird.
I understand that perspective. I just, I think having a licensing system is important, but like nonetheless, there's going to be someone out there that's going to crack your plugin and put it in the wares department, and people that are shopping in that department, like, it's probably the minority of people, and most people are good, most people are honest, and they will value what you're doing enough to pay you like $35 or whatever it is.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh no, I didn't mean to interrupt you. How are your sales going? Like, do you feel like it's being well received? Are you finding it a challenge? I'm just kind of curious about, like, your early stage marketing of a plugin experiences.
There's a lot of things that I feel like I'm, in running a business, for the first time really, that I feel like, confident about, like I'm doing this really well and I'm doing this right. And then there's other areas where I'm like, I know that I'm just like kind of totally winging it.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of new business owners, can relate, but it really took off, especially, John, over at Plugin Guru, was a significant help to me in getting the word out on it early.
Yeah.
And things are going well, and it's not amazing, it's not terrible, but it's going, and it's encouraging, and I do get a lot of positive feedback and good reviews from people. It's been very rare that anyone had anything negative to say, so.
Yeah.
It's all very encouraging, and it makes me want to make another plugin and kind of keep going.
Yeah, that's where I kind of wanted to leave it. I don't want you to divulge any secrets, but like, are you thinking about new plugin ideas, and like what kind of broad category might those be in?
Yeah, so I have 3 actually, and I also have a tool for developers that I am working on. That's it's actually on my GitHub in sort of like an alpha state right now. It's a signal generator that you can use math expressions to create a signal tone.
Oh, that's cool.
And then that's one component of it is that, and that's one plugin. But then there's a sister plugin that's an analyzer. So it's kind of like Plugin Doctor, where you can you can create a source signal, and then the analyzer portion does all kinds of analytics on it. Frequency response, phase response. You can do like Farina IRs and all kinds of cool stuff in it. So that is a product that is going to be free and out, but it's really just kind of for developers, people who want to get really nerdy about testing their plugins.
Right.
There's something, I can't really divulge a whole lot, especially because, and I won't name names, but there's the CEO of a very big, very well-known plugin company bought my plugin, and I reached out to him on LinkedIn, friendly, to thank him and whatnot, and try to get his feedback and stuff. No response, and then one of his developers reaches out to me to connect, but won't respond. And so like I'm I'm kind of like, I feel like I'm being a little bit kind of peaked on.
Yeah, yeah.
But I do have some ideas that are very unique, that are kind of like Wavefield, where there's nothing else
Awesome.
like it. One of them is in the spatial audio realm, spatial binaural kind of 3D
Oh,
space
very
realm.
cool. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then there's another one that's a synth, and another one
Oh,
that's
fun.
a granular, let's say, sound destroyer.
Nifty. Well, those are all great ideas. I can't wait to see and hear what you come up with.
Yeah,
Um,
thank you, Keith.
yeah, I do have one of the like super nerdly question. I was like, what are your development tools like? So are you using JUCE or what do you use as your framework?
Yeah, I am using JUCE and Xcode. I code primarily on Mac, and then I run my coding sessions in VSC with the
Uh-huh.
Claude code extension.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, that
What about
basically solves it.
what about you?
Do you also use
What's your
so
setup?
I'm a big Codex guy. So I use Codex. Obviously I'm just in VS Code. Um, for planning and really gnarly coding stuff, it's Codex that does it. I well, it's like I design all the algorithms and stuff, right? But I hate writing C++. Like I haven't written C++, uh since I initially learned it. And then like for no good reason, I'm a little bit anti-framework. So Liminal Space was like an experiment in could you just build a plugin using clap? Like that's the just clap. And then like for my UI, like I used like an immediate mode GUI that you would use in game environments because I wanted to be able to visualize the exact like the LFO buffers and stuff. So
Okay.
literally what liminal space does is it's sending the current shape of the LFOs like up to the GUI. And the GUI is GPU accelerated and all this stuff, but it doesn't rely on any any classes that you would have like in JUCE.
Gotcha.
So at
Gotcha.
one level, it's possibly more performant than you could get with anything else, but it was kind of just an exercise in showing off. You know what I mean? Like you could do it a bunch of other ways, but I'm like, I'm pretty sure there's no plugin that's like ever used the graphics package that I'm using. And I liked the retro feel of it. The it kind of looks like a game development interface, right? And I just wanted
Okay.
that
I
I just
see.
kind of I wanted that feel, and so I'm like, well, this package already has all that stuff. Like its line plots are like exactly what I wanted them to look like. So I'm like, well, why would I don't have to develop anything else. I can just do like blit the waveform shape, like directly into this widget, and it just appears there. And it does that 50
Totally.
times a
Totally.
second. So it's kind of fun. But that
Yeah,
yeah,
I only
but
leave the framework if I have to. I
yeah,
have. I've had to for some things,
yeah.
but
Well, there was a
yeah,
big
that's
mistake.
interesting.
It was not the right thing to do. It was kind of a mistake. And then like Shane was like, because I passed it to Shane because I'm like, here's the problem. Like I'm not a Mac guy, so I can't build this for Mac. And then he was kind of like, I can only kind of sort of build this because he's very like he's very much in JUCE. And I was like, whoops, sorry about that. So he kind of tried to do a port of it to JUCE, but I'm like, well, you don't really have to do that. But he was, his feeling was like, well, that's the only way I would be comfortable working on this. So anyway, someday there will be a Mac build of
Yeah,
Liminal
well, I mean,
Space.
like, hey, if you're comfortable sending it to me, I can give it a shot.
Oh, I'm gonna invite you to my repo. You can
Okay.
see what
Yeah.
insanity I have wrought. Awesome. Seth, it was great talking with you. I really appreciate your time. I want to tell my audience again, go and get Wavefield. It's really awesome. It's at Fine Increments, not Fine Instruments, fineincrements.com, correct?
That's right.
Cool.
Yeah.
And you can check
Thank you
out
so
Seth's.
much, Keith,
Yeah,
for having me on your channel. It's been
you're
really
welcome.
fun. And yeah, Wavefield for the next 3 days is still at the introductory price. So
Awesome.
if that
You might
helps.
want to extend that an extra 2 days because it'll probably take me another day to get this out. But maybe if you want to do a coupon code, for my subscribers, I can share that in this video as well.
Oh yeah, you might be able to
It's
do something
something
like
to
that.
think about.